Welcome, Dr. Farnsworth, to the World XP podcast. I really appreciate you taking the time out of your day to talk to me today. For those listening, this is a little bit of an out of cycle release, but with the current events in the Russia-Ukraine sort of department of the world, I figured I'd try and find somebody who is an expert in the international relations field, and I have found one, and I got lucky. So, Dr. Farnsworth, welcome.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
And for those listening, Dr. Farnsworth, you are a professor at Mary Washington. What is your sort of background so those listening have an idea?
Yeah, well, I'm particularly interested in presidential communication. And so a lot of my research focuses on presidents and media messages. For the purposes of this conversation, though, I should add that I have been involved in a number of media development projects in the nations of the former Soviet Union. I've been to Ukraine 3 or 4 times. I've been to Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Georgia in the Caucasus, working with reporters, talking about how to build civil society and try to create an environment that is going to lead to more democratic developments in these countries. These were USAID funded projects. And so that's one of the reasons why this is a topic of great interest to me. I was a journalist myself, and working with other journalists has been one of the things that I've really enjoyed as part of what I do as a professor.
Awesome. So I guess we could start with just sort of how did we get here? Obviously, since the Cold War, there's been tensions between Russia and the U.S., meddling in elections, whether how much that takes place or not, or all the sorts of things we've heard of through the news throughout the last decade, I guess. But how did we get to this point where Putin decides that he needs to do this?
Well, we got to this point because Putin wanted to get to this point. I mean, fundamentally, the choice of creating this environment was Putin's. The dynamic that Putin sees is that he doesn't accept the breakup of the Soviet Union, the end of the Cold War. And he's doing what he can to try to restore as much as possible the world as it existed before Gorbachev. The idea that the Soviet Union would be a part of a bipolar world environment where it was right up with the United States was something in the past. But Putin has the same vision for a revived Russia. And so in many ways, Putin in some ways has gotten his wish. You know, the Europeans are unified in a way that they haven't been since the Cold War. The US is more focused on Eastern Europe than it has been since the start of the Iraq War 15, 20 years ago. And so the dynamics here, I think, are pretty powerful. And it creates an environment that Putin may be getting what he wants in terms of this implacable hostility of the West and sort of rebuilding that Cold War dynamic. But obviously, in other ways, he's not getting what he wants. I mean, the idea that there was going to be such a powerful response to Russian aggression. Even Swiss bankers are on the side of the West and turning against Russia. So it's created, I think, a really very dangerous financial crisis for the Russian domestic economy. The Russian economy, that when we're talking here on Tuesday afternoon, the Russians refuse to open their currency markets and their stock markets on Monday, and then again today on Tuesday. And it's an open question whether they'll be able to do it on Thursday, because when this opens, it's going to be a devastating hit because the world basically has done all it can to isolate Russia from the international financial system.
And gotcha. So we've heard a lot in the news about different sanctions. And actually, before I get to that, from Putin's standpoint of reuniting the Soviet Union, is Ukraine the logical first step, or is it just because of the kind of turmoil that was there with Crimea in 2014 and that sort of thing that he figured that's a good spot to start, or were there other reasons that that's where he's chosen to kind of kick things off?
Well, of course, he can't fully rebuild the Soviet Union.
Sure.
Many other countries have gone their own way, but the Ukraine is a special case for Russians. I mean, these are, when you think about Belarus and Ukraine and Russia, these are countries that came up together. They're dominant by Slavic Orthodox religions. And so there are certain cultural affinities. And of course, during the time of the czars, Russia had control over the territory, most of the territory that is now Ukraine. It's also geopolitically a really important reality. When you think about any kind of military engagement involving Russia and Europe, Ukraine is the main way through, east and west. When Napoleon went to Moscow, he went through Ukraine. When the Nazis went to Moscow, they went through Ukraine. And then when the Russians fought back, they fought back going through what is now Ukraine. It's an area that creates a lot of military movement back and forth, particularly as you're thinking about Russia feeling worried about the international environment, that Ukraine is one of the places where they might want to see a significant distance between Ukraine and the rest of Europe. This is also, of course, an issue for domestic politics in Russia, right? I mean, if Ukraine can build a viable, healthy, democratic society, well, maybe that could happen in Russia too. And, you know, it's not useful for Putin's brand of autocracy, where anybody who disagrees with him is at risk of being poisoned or jailed or killed, to have a system that is built in Ukraine that would be a model for what the Russians could do themselves. And so I think it's important for Putin, as he sees the world, to make these kinds of choices. Now, obviously, the Ukrainians had other ideas. I mean, despite being immensely outgunned, and the resources that you have with respect to the Russian government versus the Ukrainian government, the resistance has been much more than Putin expected, and it's created significant problems in terms of a military engagement that I think Putin expected would have decapitated the leadership in Kyiv by now.
That makes sense. I want to ask one more question about kind of the lead up to this, and then we can get into how things are currently and then maybe potential future things. But one of the things that I found interesting was when those eastern regions, Donetsk and I forgot what the other one was called, they had kind of declared their own independence, for lack of a better description, back in, I think, 2015, was it? Why did he not kind of swoop in then to maybe pick those up? It seemed like it would have been a good opportunity.
Right. Well, there is a part of Ukraine that the Putin government did sweep in, the Crimea,
Right.
and so that area, which is part of internationally recognized borders of Ukraine, was annexed by Russia in 2014. And then the areas that you're talking about, Donetsk, Luhansk, this is on the Russia-Ukrainian border, but the Ukrainian side of the line. These are areas that have more ethnic Russians than other parts of Ukraine. Their Russian speaking is a bit more common rather than Ukrainian speaking, which is the norm in most of the rest of the country. And so you had an environment where Putin was making the case that there were ethnic Russians that were at risk of being undermined or stepped on by Ukrainians who speak Ukrainian, who view the world as Ukrainians, not as a sort of a Russian province, as some Russians might look at Ukraine. And so those kinds of things were part of the process. But even now, the Russian government only controls parts of these provinces. And so the autonomy that they declared and the autonomy that exists at the moment is not something that is going to be resolved with existing borders. You see, you have a Russian idea that they want to get the rest of these regions and create these independent republics. This is exactly the play, by the way, that Putin used in Georgia back in 2008, when there were some areas close to the Russia-Georgia border where Putin once again tried to figure out ways to create areas that were under Russian control, directly or indirectly. In practice, it's direct Russian control, but they like to pretend that it's not. But this creates an environment, and this is why Putin does it this way, in which neither of these countries can join NATO. If you think about an area that is part of your country that is occupied by Russia, you don't have territorial integrity, which is one of the preconditions for being into NATO, that you have control over your entire national state. And so by taking these pieces of Ukraine or Georgia and putting them under Russian control, effectively Putin can block these countries going into NATO. As you recall, this was the main argument that Putin was using against Ukraine in recent weeks, saying that the risk of NATO joining with Ukraine was unacceptable.
Does that hold any water, or did he kind of seems to you like he planned on doing it anyways, or was this sort of what are your thoughts on that? Without, I know it's a little bit of speculation, but
Well, certainly, the situation 3 weeks ago was already sufficient to keep Ukraine out of NATO in the short term, as long as the region of the Crimea and the Donbass and Luhansk were under Russian control, effectively, not under Ukrainian government control. There wasn't going to be an admission of Ukraine to NATO, because it would immediately trigger. If Ukraine were part of NATO and Ukraine had been attacked, then the nations of the NATO are pledged to defend each other in these cases. And so basically, if NATO said that Ukraine was in NATO now, you basically be talking about a war with Europe and America against the Russians. And nobody wants to go down that road. People are very sympathetic. And they're certainly willing to provide, the U.S. government and other governments provide arms and other materiel for the Ukrainian defense. But the idea of a direct scenario where Americans are pointing guns at Russians is a really, really dangerous scenario, one to be avoided at all costs.
Yeah, absolutely. So also, it seems like since 2014, their kind of territory would have been compromised, so it wouldn't have mattered at that point then anyways. Is that
right, and that's why it's so important to recognize that what Putin is doing now is very much something that he chose to do. The status quo with the occupations of the previous engagement back in 2014 were sufficient to keep both Georgia and Ukraine out of NATO. So if that was all he cared about, mission is already accomplished. This is something very different. Now he's basically deciding that he wants to get rid of the Ukrainian government. He wants to install presumably a puppet regime or take more control of the country than he does now. And so we're not sure exactly what the end game is, because Putin, of course, isn't one to tell the truth, and he certainly isn't one to be telegraphing his intentions ahead of time. Remember, for weeks and weeks and weeks, the Russians said there wasn't going to be a war, and here we are. So given those things, one can only speculate so much about what Putin wants, but certainly what we see so far is that his vision is far more than just keeping Ukraine out of NATO. He already had that base covered 3-4 weeks ago. He had it covered in 2014.
Gotcha. That's not something that I've seen reported widely, to be honest. But now that they've done this, we hear a lot about sanctions that they're imposing. NATO, et cetera, has been imposing against the Russians. What do those sorts of things entail? Because I think we in the general public hear the word sanctions, and we kind of just don't really know what it means as a public. So what kind of, for this specific instance, what has been entailed and imposed on the Russians?
Yeah, well, think of this as kind of a punishment, that, it's not an invasion, it's not a counterattack, but it's an economic punishment. And the impacts can be pretty substantial. If you had a bank account in rubles, and it falls by 30%, $1,000 becomes, $700 overnight, that's going to really hurt. And, a lot of people don't have that much money. And if you try to convert your rubles to dollars or to euros or to yen, the markets, international currency markets, are all closed to you. Where this is really going to hit, of course, is the ability of the Russian government to pay its debts. If you want to pay your troops in the field, it'd be nice if you were paying them with a currency that was worth something. If you wanted to get something by way of replenishment of food or other materials, anything that you want in the international marketplace, you're not going to be able to pay for it. So who's going to give it to you? Now maybe there's some kind of deal that can be reached with the Russians and the Chinese. The Chinese want to keep Russia strong enough so that it can help China counter the United States. So there is some interest in Russia doing okay. But at the same time, China doesn't want to be put in that same penalty box that the Russians are in right now. And that's going to be something that they're sort of having to work through, because China has significant trade with Ukraine, significant independent economic activity with the West, and China is not interested in compromising those sorts of things to help Russia get out of a jam. So my guess is that Russia more or less is on its own, except for countries that are really not much of a position to help. I mean, the Belarus cannot really do much to help the Russians. And that's the closest ally they have right now. And then the occasional Marxist government in Southeast Asia or South America or someplace, where's that going to get you? You don't have any real assistance in the international market. It's also going to really hurt the oligarchs, and it's going to hurt the military because of resupply issues. But also the fact is that these are people who've for years planned on being able to go to London or Paris if the going gets good, and they have these properties internationally, but they can't get to them because of no-fly zones. And so you've got all these dynamics of the oligarchs who would like to have their assets remain valuable, who don't want to see things decline. And so this is a problem. I mean, and it's a problem even for the people at the bottom of the economic heap, because you can have significant increases in prices of bread. You can have factories that can't open and can't pay you because they can't get products from abroad because of embargoes and because of sanctions. You've got all of these kinds of things that are going to create a very unappealing environment for Putin. I'm not saying that all this leads to a 1917 scenario. One can't really predict those things, but it's going to hurt, and it's going to be a problem. And this is why I think Putin has been ramping up the resources that he's throwing at Ukraine over the last several days, because he knows that this can't go on indefinitely, that this won't be helpful to his position vis-a-vis the oligarchs, vis-a-vis the military, vis-a-vis the country's population, if this ugliness continues week after week, month after month.
Right. That makes sense. That was the other thing that I was going to ask you. It seems to have been, at least from what I've been reading, hearing about the Russian military, it seemed like this would have or should have been over already, but they seem to be having more difficulty than I think people anticipated. Is there any, I could think of maybe the Russian military is not as prepared or equipped as everybody thought, or have the Ukrainians just been putting up really good resistance, or kind of what's the situation there?
Well, I think it's a little bit of all of these things. I mean, ultimately, this is the lesson of any country that tries to invade another country in the modern era. You have a significant, vigorous defense that will be put together. I mean, if you think about the American Revolution and the Brits coming to the North America, that didn't work out so well for them, in part because it's hard to invade another place. You see the same thing with respect to the U.S. and Afghanistan, or the U.S. and Vietnam, or the Soviet Union and Afghanistan. I mean, you can, with significant military advantages, really reduce a place to rubble. That's what the Russians did in Chechnya. But the reality is that you don't win. At most you have an expensive, bloody, and ultimately unsuccessful occupation of the conquered territory. You think about the IRA, and that may be the scenario that is most instructive as we might think about what happens next in Ukraine. I mean, maybe the Ukrainians will be able to continue to resist at the level that they're resisting. Maybe they won't. But if for Putin he gets what he wants in the end, and there's the government in Kyiv is tossed aside, and he's able to impose a new government, how long is that government going to last? And how much government security will the Russians be required to place if it's a government imposed by outsiders over their own people? You have even when you win, you lose, it seems to me, from the Russian perspective here. And this is one of the reasons why I consider this kind of a baffling choice by Putin. The scenario of Ukraine and NATO, it wasn't going to happen anyway in the short term because of the occupation of Crimea and the Donbass, and that division that you saw in Europe a month ago. Some of these countries are more pro-Russian than others in the European Union. Now they're all on side. The opinion in Finland for joining NATO, it was 19% a couple of years ago. It's now over 50%. This is a country right up tight against Russia that has always argued that the best way to deal with the Russians was not to antagonize them. That you can be the Finnish argument was you can be independent, or you can be a tiny Finnish speaking province in the Russian empire, and they sort of had to tread carefully. Sweden, another neutral country, also tried to sort of navigate between the shoals of NATO and the like. Both of these countries may very well be in NATO by the end of the year because of the actions that Russia has taken and the fears that it has generated within even independent nations, separate from NATO and the European Union, in Europe, and Switzerland, of course, among them.
Right. So, what are we looking at, kind of going forward, with both U.S. options and in Europe more broadly? What kind of things do you sort of foresee, or are potential options for what could be happening in the next week, month, etc.?
Well, I think that a lot is going to depend on the impact of these sanctions. That is not a trivial matter. There is a significant effort at resupplying the Ukrainians in defensive weapons. Will that be able to continue? Will the Ukrainians still be able to have materials delivered inside the country? What will be the status of Kyiv and going forward? I mean, there are so many uncertainties about how this process works out. I think that we recognize the limitations of prediction when we recognize that just about all of the folks who really study the military — I don't study the militaries particularly — all of them thought that Russians would be able to conquer the capital within 4 days, and we're already almost a week into this, and Ukrainian defenses seem to be holding pretty well around the capital. And whether that will continue to be the case, who knows? But I hesitate to say much by way of predictions because, of course, the people who know a lot more about the military configurations, the armaments and capacities of the Russian Ukrainian military, people who know a lot more about that stuff than I do, didn't particularly end up with a prediction that was borne out in the first week of fighting.
Gotcha. Well, it's 3:30. I appreciate your time. Hopefully all you guys listening learned something. I sure did. I think, do you have a few books out as well? I think, is that accurate?
Yes. There's Presidential Communication and Character, that studies how presidents sell themselves to the country. There's The Global President, that talks about how the U.S. and the U.S. presidents sell themselves around the world in terms of how they present the United States and the president in particular to global audiences. There's another book that's not particularly relevant to this conversation today, Late Night with Trump: Political Humor in the American Presidency. I look at late night humor and how they deal with politics. But basically, this is a really, really important moment in global history. And so it's horrific what's happening. You look at the pictures and you feel just horrible about the suffering that people are going through, and it's doubly a tragedy when you think about how this was the choice of one person to cause all this mayhem for an outcome that won't even end up being all that successful for him.
Yeah. Well, fingers crossed we don't end up in World War III. I think that would be horrific for everyone involved. If you guys are interested in his books, I'll put the links to those down in the description below. And with that, I appreciate your time. I hope you have a good rest of your day. Bye, everybody.